There's a question at the heart of spiritual experience that most religious people never examine honestly. What's the foundation of your relationship with the sacred? Is it love, genuine affection, gratitude and wonder at existence? Or is it fear, the terror of judgment, the anxiety about punishment, the constant awareness that you're being watched and evaluated? Most believers would immediately say love. But when you look at how religion actually operates in their lives, you find something different. You find people who don't pray primarily from joy, but from obligation mixed with fear, who don't follow religious teachings because they enhance life, but because they're terrified of consequences for not following them. Think about the actual language of traditional religion. Fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. You're taught to be afraid as the foundation of spiritual understanding. The fear of the Lord is pure, enduring forever. Fear is presented not as something to overcome, but as something to maintain perpetually. You're told God is love, but in the same breath you're warned about eternal punishment. You're encouraged to feel grateful, but the gratitude is inseparable from terror about what you've been saved from. This isn't love in any recognizable sense. It's Stockholm Syndrome dressed in theological language. Now consider what this does to your experience of life itself. When your spirituality is built on fearing God, everything becomes pervaded by anxiety. You can't fully enjoy experiences because pleasure might lead to sin. You can't relax into existence because you're constantly monitoring yourself for thoughts or behaviors God might condemn. You can't embrace life without reservation because life itself becomes suspect. Too much joy in earthly things might mean you're not focused enough on heavenly things. The fear doesn't stay confined to your God relationship. It bleeds into everything, making your entire existence anxious. But here's what should strike you as profoundly wrong about this framework. If there is something sacred about existence, if life itself has spiritual significance, wouldn't the appropriate response be love rather than fear? Wouldn't genuine spirituality involve celebrating existence, embracing life, feeling wonder and gratitude for the sheer fact of being alive? How did we get to a place where the dominant spiritual framework is organized around terror of divine punishment rather than love of life itself? A philosopher in the 19th century looked at this pattern and saw something others had missed or were too frightened to articulate. He recognized that fear-based religion wasn't just one approach among many. It was fundamentally opposed to genuine spirituality. Real spiritual experience, he argued, comes from saying yes to life, from loving existence so fully that you'd willingly live the same life infinitely. It comes from embracing your own vitality, celebrating your capacities, finding the sacred in immediate experience rather than in an imagined God who judges and punishes. He saw that religion had inverted everything. It had taken the most profound spiritual impulse, love of life itself, and replaced it with fear of divine authority. It had made people suspicious of their own existence, guilty about enjoying being alive, anxious about every natural impulse. And it called this fear-based framework spirituality, while actual spiritual experience, the deep yes to existence, was condemned as worldly, carnal, or insufficiently focused on God. This isn't about atheism versus theism. It's about examining what genuine spirituality actually feels like versus what fear-based religion produces. Because if your spiritual framework makes you afraid of life, suspicious of joy, and anxious about your own existence, it's not making you more spiritual, it's making you less alive. And being less alive is the opposite of what spirituality should accomplish. Here's the anomaly that should immediately disturb anyone examining traditional religion. The beings and traditions that are supposed to represent ultimate love and ultimate good use, fear as their primary motivational tool. You're told God loves you unconditionally, but the condition is clear: believe correctly or face eternal torture. You're taught that following religious law brings abundant life, but you follow it primarily because you're terrified of what happens if you don't. The claimed foundation is love. The actual operation is fear. Look at how religious teaching about God is structured. The emphasis falls overwhelmingly on God's power to punish, God's judgment of your worthiness, God's ability to send you to eternal suffering. Yes, God's love is mentioned, but it's always shadowed by the threat. God so loved the world that he gave his only son. But if you don't accept that sacrifice, you're damned. The love is conditional, and the conditions are enforced through ultimate threat. This isn't a loving relationship by any healthy standard. It's a protection racket. Now compare this to how life-affirming philosophies approach the sacred. Buddhist enlightenment is about liberation from suffering through understanding, not terror of divine punishment. Taoist spirituality emphasizes harmony with the natural flow of life, not fear of a judging deity. Ancient Greek spirituality celebrated excellence and beauty in living, not anxiety about afterlife consequences. The intense focus on fear as the foundation of spirituality is actually unusual, and that unusualness should make you question what function it serves. What makes this particularly striking is examining which human experiences fear-based religion treats as dangerous. Joy in physical existence, suspect, might make you too worldly. Deep pleasure in relationships, dangerous, might become idolatry. Pride in your own abilities, sinful, takes glory from God. Anger at injustice, inappropriate, you should trust God's plan. Love of your own life, problematic, you should be focused on the next life. Every natural human experience of vitality, power, and life affirmation gets categorized as spiritually dangerous. Consider what this does to people's capacity for spiritual experience. Genuine spiritual moments, experiences of transcendence, unity, overwhelming love, profound peace, typically happen when people are fully present and open to existence. But fear-based religion trains you to be closed, defended, monitoring yourself constantly for sin. You can't be fully present when you're always worried about being judged. You can't experience transcendence when you're anxious about punishment. The framework that claims to facilitate spiritual experience actually prevents it. The pattern becomes clearer when you examine who emphasizes fear-based spirituality most strongly. It's not mystics who've had direct spiritual experiences. They tend to speak of love, unity, and liberation. It's institutional authorities who need populations to comply with rules. Fear is a far more reliable control mechanism than love. People who love their lives might make autonomous choices. People who fear divine punishment are more predictable. The emphasis on fear serves institutional control, not spiritual development. Look at the psychological profile fear-based religion produces. Chronic guilt, constant need, self-monitoring, anxiety about being judged, difficulty experiencing joy, suspicion of natural impulses, need for external validation. These aren't symptoms of spiritual growth. They're symptoms of psychological damage. Yet religion presents them as evidence of proper spiritual awareness. You're supposed to feel guilty, anxious, and afraid. That's how you know you're taking God seriously. What's most revealing is examining what happens when people leave fear-based religion. They often report that their capacity for genuine spiritual experience increases dramatically. Without the terror of divine judgment, they can actually be present to life. Without constant guilt, they can experience wonder and gratitude. Without the framework that made joy suspect, they can embrace existence fully. The removal of fear doesn't destroy spirituality, it liberates it. Friedrich Nietzsche's journey from fear-based religion to life-affirming philosophy wasn't intellectual abstraction. It was lived transformation born from profound suffering. Growing up in a strict Lutheran household, he learned early that proper spirituality meant constant awareness of God's judgment, fear of divine wrath, and suspicion of earthly joy. His father died when he was 5, and the family's religious framework explained this tragedy as God's mysterious plan, something to accept with faith rather than protest with grief. This early experience planted a seed of doubt. Young Friedrich felt overwhelming sadness and anger at his father's death. But his religion told him these feelings were inappropriate. He should trust God's wisdom, accept divine will, find spiritual meaning in loss. But the actual experience was just pain, profound, meaningless pain that religious explanations didn't alleviate. He learned early the disconnect between what religion claimed about life and what life actually felt like. By his teenage years, Nietzsche was experiencing the full burden of a fear-based spirituality. He monitored his thoughts constantly for sinful impulses. He felt guilty about natural desires. He worried obsessively about whether he had enough faith, whether his beliefs were correct, whether God would judge him worthy. This wasn't bringing him closer to any genuine spiritual experience. It was making him anxious, guilty, and disconnected from his own life. The framework that promised abundant spiritual life was actually draining the vitality from his existence. At 24, as a professor of classical philology, Nietzsche encountered ancient Greek philosophy and culture. What struck him profoundly was their relationship to life. Greeks didn't organize their existence around fear of divine judgment. They celebrated life, beauty, strength, creativity, pleasure, excellence. Their spirituality wasn't about appeasing angry gods, but about living well, achieving arete, excellence, creating and experiencing intensely. They said yes to existence rather than approaching it with fearful suspicion. This contrast crystallized something Nietzsche had felt, but couldn't articulate. Christian spirituality, organized around fearing God, was fundamentally life-denying. It made you suspicious of your own existence, guilty about enjoying being alive, anxious about natural human experiences. Greek vitalism, organized around loving life, was life-affirming. It celebrated existence, embraced human capacities, found the sacred in living fully rather than in fearing divine punishment. What radicalized Nietzsche's thinking was his own health crisis. In his 30s, he experienced devastating physical suffering, chronic migraines, vision problems, digestive issues that left him bedridden. Traditional Christianity told him this suffering was redemptive, that it brought him closer to God, that it would be compensated in heaven. But Nietzsche experienced how this framework prevented him from doing everything possible to reduce the suffering. If pain is spiritually valuable, why fight it urgently? The fear-based religious framework made him more passive in face of preventable suffering. He began a profound experiment. What if he rejected the fear-based God entirely? Not as angry rebellion, but as conscious choice to organize his life around different values. What if, instead of fearing divine judgment, he loved life itself? What if, instead of seeking God's approval, he sought to live so fully that he'd willing live the same life eternally? What if the sacred wasn't a distant judging deity, but the immediate experience of vital existence? This shift was simultaneously liberating and terrifying. Without God to fear, Nietzsche had no external authority defining right and wrong, no cosmic parent ensuring justice, no promise of heavenly compensation. He was radically alone with his own life, fully responsible for creating meaning and value. But this aloneness was also freedom. He could say yes to experiences without guilt, pursue excellence without calling it pride, embrace his own power without fearing divine punishment. In 1879, he resigned his professorship and spent the next decade living in poverty, isolation, and continued physical suffering, but also in a state of creative intensity that produced his most profound work. He was living the philosophy of life affirmation in the hardest possible conditions. No comfortable belief in divine plan, no promise of heavenly compensation, just the raw experience of existence, which he chose to love rather than resent, to affirm rather than deny, to celebrate rather than escape through religious fantasies. The first evidence Nietzsche presents is elegantly simple. Compare how fear-based religion makes you feel about life versus how you feel in moments of genuine vital experience. When you're fully alive, experiencing beauty, creating something meaningful, connecting deeply with others, pushing your capacities. Do you feel closer to something sacred, or do you feel guilty that you're not focused enough on God? The answer reveals whether your spiritual framework serves life or suppresses it. Look at what happens to people's experience of beauty under fear-based religion. You see a breathtaking sunset, and your first impulse should be wonder and gratitude. But religious training intercepts this. You're supposed to thank God for the sunset, rather than simply experiencing it fully. The immediate encounter with beauty, gets mediated through theology. You're not present to the actual experience. You're performing a religious response. The framework prevents direct engagement with life. Examine how fear-based religion treats moments of joy and pleasure. If you experience deep happiness, religious training makes you suspicious. Are you enjoying earthly things too much? Is this pleasure distracting you from God? Should you be thinking about eternal things instead? The joy itself gets poisoned by anxiety about whether experiencing it is spiritually appropriate. You can't fully embrace positive experiences because your spiritual framework has trained you to distrust them. Now consider what happens in moments of genuine spiritual transcendence, experiences of unity, profound peace, overwhelming love, connection to something larger than yourself. These moments typically happen when you're fully present and open, not when you're afraid and defended. Yet, fear-based religion keeps you in a state of chronic anxiety that prevents exactly the openness required for transcendent experience. The framework claiming to facilitate spiritual connection actually blocks it. The evidence becomes even clearer when you examine people's relationship with their own bodies and physical existence. Fear-based religion treats the body as fallen, dangerous, something to transcend. Physical pleasure is suspect. Bodily needs are inconvenient distractions from spiritual focus. Your embodied existence is something to be disciplined, controlled, made subservient to spirit. But this creates alienation from your actual lived experience. You can't love life while hating the body through which you experience it. Look at how religious people approach death and mortality. Fear-based religion frames death as judgment, the moment when you face God's verdict on your worthiness. This makes mortality terrifying rather than using mortality awareness to value life more deeply. The fear of judgment prevents healthy engagement with death that might make you treasure the life you have. Instead of mortality making life precious, religious fear makes both life and death sources of anxiety. Consider what fear-based religion does to people's capacity for authentic relationships. If you're constantly monitoring yourself for sinful thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, you can't be fully present with others. If you're always aware you're being judged by God, you can't relax into genuine intimacy. If you're anxious about whether your feelings are spiritually appropriate, you can't experience authentic emotional connection. The fear-based framework prevents the vulnerability required for real relationship. What's most revealing is examining moments when people break free from religious fear, even temporarily. A person raised in strict religion might have an experience, falling in love, creating art, dancing freely, experiencing nature intensely, where they forget about God's judgment and just live. And in that moment, they often feel more spiritual, more connected, more alive than they ever felt in formal religious practice. This reveals that the fear wasn't bringing them closer to the sacred, it was keeping them from it. The evidence extends to how people experience their own aliveness and vitality. Life-affirming philosophies say yes to your energy, your desires, your power to create and build. Fear-based religion says be suspicious of these. They might be pride, worldliness, or distraction from God. The result is that people suppress their own vitality and call it spirituality. But dampening your aliveness isn't spiritual growth, it's spiritual death. Nietzsche digs deeper by examining what he calls vitalism, the philosophical position that life itself is the primary value, that affirming and enhancing life is the foundation of genuine ethics and spirituality. This isn't hedonism or mere pleasure-seeking. It's the recognition that whatever is truly sacred must be life-affirming rather than life-denying. If a belief system makes you less alive, less capable of experiencing and creating, less able to embrace existence, it's working against the sacred rather than toward it. The investigation reveals a crucial distinction. Life-affirming spirituality says yes to existence, yes to your body, yes to your desires, yes to your power, yes to this world, yes to becoming more fully who you are. Fear-based religion says no. No to pride, no to earthly attachment, no to trusting yourself, no to this world's importance, no to your natural impulses. These aren't just different approaches. They're fundamentally opposed orientations toward existence itself. Consider Nietzsche's concept of amor fati, love of fate. This means embracing your actual life so completely that you'd willing live it again, exactly as it is, infinitely. Not passive resignation, but active affirmation. You love your life, including its struggles and pain, because it's your life, the only one you have, and it's made you who you are. This is profoundly different from religious frameworks that teach you to accept suffering while waiting for compensation in another life. Amor fati means this life, as it actually is enough to love. The deeper investigation shows how fear-based religion and life affirmation produce completely different psychological states. Fear-based religion creates chronic anxiety. You're always being watched, always potentially failing, always at risk of divine punishment. Life affirmation creates a sense of permission. You're allowed to exist, to experience, to become who you are. The contrast isn't subtle. One framework makes you anxious about your own existence. The other gives you permission to inhabit it fully. Nietzsche traced this to what he saw as Christianity's fundamental error, locating the sacred outside life, rather than within it. By placing God above and beyond the world, Christianity made earthly existence spiritually secondary. Real life, real value, real meaning were elsewhere, in heaven, in eternity, in God. This necessarily devalued actual lived experience. Life-affirming philosophy relocates the sacred. It's not elsewhere but here, not later but now, not in some distant deity but in existence itself. What makes this particularly profound is examining what it means for your daily experience. If the sacred is distant and you must fear it, every moment becomes pervaded by anxiety about whether you're measuring up. If the sacred is immediate and you can love it, every moment becomes an opportunity for genuine spiritual experience. The shift from fear to love doesn't just change your theology, it transforms your moment-to-moment experience of being alive. The investigation reveals how this affects your relationship with desire. Fear-based religion treats desire as dangerous. It might lead to sin, might distract you from God, might make you too attached to earthly things. You're taught to suppress desire, or at least be constantly suspicious of it. Life affirmation treats desire differently. It's your vitality expressing itself, your life force moving you toward experiences and creations. Desire isn't something to fear and suppress, but something to understand and channel. Consider how this plays out with power and capability. Fear-based religion teaches that recognizing your own power is pride, that confidence in your abilities is arrogance, that human strength is inherently suspicious. Life affirmation says your capacities are expressions of life's power flowing through you. Developing and using them isn't pride, it's fulfilling your potential, becoming what you're capable of being. The framework determines whether you see your strength as problem or possibility. What emerges from deeper investigation is that the choice between fear-based religion and life affirmation isn't really about belief in God. It's about your fundamental orientation toward existence. Do you approach life with suspicion and anxiety, always worried you're doing it wrong? Or do you approach it with love and affirmation, embracing the experience of being alive? The first produces chronic suffering regardless of what happens externally. The second allows joy even in difficult circumstances. The pattern becomes unmistakable once you see it clearly. Fear-based religion systematically trains you to be afraid of the very experiences that might give you genuine spiritual connection, joy, vitality, presence, authentic relationship, love of your own existence. It doesn't facilitate spiritual experience. It prevents it by keeping you in a state of chronic anxiety that makes openness impossible. Meanwhile, what it calls spirituality is actually just managed fear, disguised as devotion. Look at how this pattern plays out in religious practice. Prayer in fear-based frameworks is primarily petition mixed with anxiety, asking God for things while worried whether you're worthy to ask, whether you're asking correctly, whether your faith is strong enough. This isn't spiritual connection. It's performance of submission under surveillance. Contrast this with meditative practices that cultivate presence and openness. These actually facilitate transcendent experience by quieting anxiety rather than intensifying it. Now examine how the pattern affects people's life choices. Fear-based religion makes people avoid experiences that might bring genuine vitality because those experiences seem spiritually dangerous. They don't pursue their passions because that might be selfish. They don't develop their unique gifts because that might be prideful. They don't embrace joy too fully because that might be worldly. They organize their entire lives around avoiding divine punishment rather than around creating and experiencing deeply. What reveals the pattern most clearly is comparing people shaped by fear-based religion to those operating from life affirmation. The first group exhibits characteristic psychological patterns: chronic guilt, difficulty experiencing joy, anxiety about being judged, suppression of vitality, waiting for permission to exist fully. The second group shows different patterns: capacity for deep engagement, ability to experience fully without guilt, trust in their own judgment, embrace of their own aliveness. The contrast reveals what each framework actually produces. Consider how the pattern affects creativity and self-expression. Creating something genuine requires believing your unique perspective matters, trusting your own vision, bringing something new into existence. But fear-based religion makes you distrust your own judgment, see your uniqueness as potential pride, question whether your creative impulses are spiritually appropriate. The framework that claims to be about expressing God's glory actually suppresses the creative capacity that might express anything at all. The pattern extends to how people handle suffering and difficulty. Fear-based religion frames suffering as punishment, as test, as something with hidden divine meaning you must accept. This makes you passive in face of preventable suffering. If it has spiritual purpose, working to eliminate it seems to miss the point. Life affirmation treats suffering as a problem to solve when possible, an experience to learn from and move through, not something to valorize or seek meaning in. One framework makes you accept preventable pain. The other motivates you to reduce it. Look at how this plays out across religious history. Movements within Christianity that emphasized life affirmation, celebrating beauty, embracing embodiment, finding the sacred in nature and human love, were consistently condemned by institutional authorities. Mystical experiences where people felt direct union with the divine were suspect because they bypassed the fear-based control mechanisms. Any spirituality that didn't center fear of judgment was attacked as dangerous heresy. What's particularly revealing is examining what changes when people escape fear-based frameworks. Those who leave such religion often report feeling more spiritual afterward, not less. Without the constant anxiety, they can actually be present to existence. Without the guilt about joy, they can experience gratitude. Without the suspicion of their own vitality, they can embrace being alive. The removal of fear doesn't destroy spirituality. It reveals that the fear was preventing genuine spiritual experience all along. Nietzsche saw that this pattern wasn't fixable within fear-based religion because the fear is the point. The framework exists to keep people anxious and compliant, not to facilitate genuine spiritual experience. Any attempt to preserve the God concept while removing the fear either fails or transforms the God into something so different it's not the same concept anymore. The choice is clear: fear-based religion or life affirmation. You can't fully have both. The implications of choosing life affirmation over fear-based religion extend into every aspect of how you experience existence. This isn't just changing your beliefs about God. It's fundamentally reorienting your relationship with being alive. And that reorientation affects everything from how you experience a morning sunrise to how you make major life decisions. Consider what happens to your experience of beauty when you're no longer filtering it through religious fear. You see something beautiful, and you can just experience it, fully present, not worried about whether you're appreciating it correctly, not guilty about enjoying it too much, not anxious that earthly beauty might distract you from heavenly focus. The experience becomes direct and unmediated. You're actually there with the beauty, rather than performing a religious response to it. The implications extend to how you relate to your own body and physical existence. Fear-based religion treats the body as fallen, as something to transcend, as spiritually suspect. This creates profound alienation. You can't fully inhabit your own embodied experience because you've been taught it's inferior to pure spirit. Life affirmation recognizes you are your body, that embodied existence is the only existence you have, that physical experience is where life happens. This shift allows you to actually live in your body, rather than treating it as a prison. Think about how this affects your capacity for joy and pleasure. Without religious guilt about enjoying existence, you can actually feel joy fully when it arises. You don't need to immediately dampen it with thoughts about how fleeting earthly pleasure is, how you should focus on eternal things, how too much happiness might be spiritually dangerous. You can just experience joy when it's present, grief when it's present, fully engaged with actual experience rather than always half elsewhere. The implications become profound when you consider meaning and purpose. Fear-based religion locates meaning outside your actual life, in God's plan, in eternal purposes, in heavenly rewards. This makes your actual lived experience feel like just preparation for real life that comes later. Life affirmation locates meaning in the living itself, in creating, experiencing, connecting, becoming who you're capable of being. Your life isn't preparation for something else. It's the thing itself. Consider what this does to your relationship with death and mortality. Fear-based religion makes death terrifying. It's Judgment Day, the moment of ultimate evaluation. Life affirmation uses mortality awareness differently. Knowing you'll die makes the life you have precious. It motivates you to live fully now, rather than waiting, to create and experience while you can, to embrace the life that's actually available, rather than deferring to imagined afterlife. Death becomes motivation for life, rather than source of terror. The implications extend to how you handle mistakes and failures. Fear-based religion frames failures as sins requiring divine forgiveness, as evidence of your unworthiness, as potentially damning. This makes failure devastating and paralyzing. Life affirmation treats failures as learning experiences, as part of the process of becoming capable, as information about what works and what doesn't. You can actually learn and grow, rather than being crushed by guilt. Think about how this affects your authentic relationships. Fear-based religion makes you monitor everything you think and feel, because God is watching and judging. This prevents genuine intimacy. You can't be fully vulnerable with others when you're not even allowed to be fully yourself with yourself. Life affirmation gives you permission to be who you actually are, which allows real connection with others who are also being themselves. The relationships become real rather than performances. What's most profound is recognizing how this shift affects your overall psychological state. Fear-based religion produces chronic anxiety, guilt, and a sense of never being quite good enough. Life affirmation produces something different, not constant happiness, but a fundamental permission to exist, to experience, to become who you are. It's the difference between living in constant fear of punishment and living with a sense that existence itself is okay. Nietzsche saw that these implications weren't just about being happier, they were about being more fully alive. Fear-based religion makes you a diminished version of yourself, always anxious and defended. Life affirmation allows you to inhabit your full existence, to develop your capacities, to experience deeply, to create and connect. It's the difference between existing under surveillance and actually living. Now we arrive at perhaps the most profound inversion in human history, and it wasn't a conspiracy because it emerged organically from psychological and institutional dynamics. Fear-based religion took the deepest spiritual impulse, love of life itself, and replaced it with fear of divine punishment. Then it convinced billions of people that this fear was actually spirituality, that their anxiety about existence was actually proper reverence, that suppressing their vitality was actually holiness. Think about how brilliantly this operates as a control system. If you can make people afraid of their own aliveness, afraid of their own joy, afraid of their own power, you don't need external control. They control themselves. They suppress their own vitality and call it virtue. They accept diminished lives and call it faithfulness. They police their own experiences and call it spiritual discipline. The fear becomes internalized so completely that people enforce it on themselves without external coercion. The coordination happened naturally because it served multiple interests. Religious institutions gained power by controlling access to salvation and defining what angered or pleased God. Keeping populations anxious about divine judgment gave authorities enormous influence. Political powers benefited because people afraid of cosmic punishment are less likely to rebel against earthly injustice. They're too busy worrying about their eternal fate. The framework served those in authority while claiming to serve everyone's spiritual needs. What makes this particularly effective is how it recruits believers into perpetuating it. Parents teach children to fear God, thinking they're protecting their souls, actually training the next generation in anxiety and life denial. Pastors preach about divine judgment, believing they're saving people, actually maintaining a system that makes people afraid of existence itself. Communities reinforce the fear through mutual surveillance and correction, all convinced they're helping each other be spiritual. Consider how this system handles resistance. If you question whether constant fear of divine judgment is healthy, you're told that questioning indicates inadequate fear. You're not taking God seriously enough. If you suggest that loving life might be more spiritual than fearing God, you're accused of being worldly, of missing eternal things, of dangerous self-focus. The system makes any attempt to escape it evidence that you need it more. The historical record shows how effectively this worked. For centuries, populations accepted terrible conditions, poverty, disease, oppression, because they were focused on fearing God and awaiting heavenly compensation. The fear-based framework made people passive in face of preventable suffering, compliant with unjust authority, and suspicious of their own impulses toward joy and liberation. It was more effective than any political system for maintaining control. Look at how this continues in modern contexts. Evangelical movements emphasize fear of judgment and need for salvation. Purity culture uses fear to control sexuality and gender expression. End times theology keeps people anxious about apocalypse rather than engaged with improving actual conditions. The specific content evolves, but the pattern persists. Keep people afraid, and you keep them controllable. What's most insidious is how the system co-opts genuine spiritual longing. Humans do yearn for transcendence, meaning connection to something larger. These are real needs, but fear-based religion captures these authentic impulses and channels them into anxiety about divine punishment and need for salvation. The genuine spiritual hunger gets exploited to maintain a system of fear rather than being fulfilled through life affirmation. Nietzsche recognized this as perhaps the most profound theft in history. stealing people's capacity to love their own lives and replacing it with fear of divine judgment, all while claiming this fear was actually the highest spirituality. The theft was so complete that people defended their stolen capacity as if reclaiming it would be spiritual death, unable to see that the fear-based framework was the real death and life affirmation was liberation. The coordination wasn't a conspiracy requiring conscious planning. It was convergent evolution toward systems that served authority while appearing to serve spiritual needs. And it succeeded so thoroughly that even now, suggesting that loving life might be more spiritual than fearing God strikes most people as obviously wrong, even blasphemous. The inversion became so normalized that the truth sounds like heresy. The question becomes urgent. If fear-based religion prevents genuine, spiritual experience while life affirmation facilitates it, why hasn't this been obvious? Why do billions continue organizing their spirituality around fearing God when examining the pattern reveals it makes them less alive rather than more? The answer exposes sophisticated mechanisms preventing recognition of what's happening. First, the framework presents fear as appropriate reverence. You're not supposed to see it as fear that damages you. It's proper fear of the Lord, holy reverence, awareness of God's majesty. The linguistic reframing makes the emotion seem virtuous rather than recognizing it as terror that prevents you from living fully. You experience chronic anxiety, but you've been taught to call it something else, which prevents you from recognizing the psychological reality. Second, fear-based religion addresses genuine existential concerns. Death is real and terrifying. Meaninglessness is a real threat. Guilt over failures is real. The framework offers answers to these concerns: eternal life, cosmic purpose, divine forgiveness. The relief these answers provide obscures the cost. The fear-based framework that delivers the answers also prevents you from living fully. People accept the cost because they're desperate for the answers. Third, everyone around you reinforces the framework. When your family, community, and culture all agree that fearing God is proper spirituality, questioning this seems wrong, rather than recognizing collective belief might be collective error. Social reality creates psychological reality. If everyone you know is afraid of divine judgment and calls it faith, doing otherwise feels crazy, rather than recognizing the collective fear might be collective damage. Fourth, the system makes questioning itself spiritually dangerous. If you doubt whether organizing life around fearing God is healthy, that doubt is categorized as weak faith, as spiritual attack, as being deceived. The framework protects itself by making critical examination a sign of spiritual failure rather than legitimate inquiry. Your observation that the fear damages you becomes evidence you're not spiritual enough rather than evidence the framework is harmful. Fifth, most people have never experienced what genuine life affirmation feels like, so they can't recognize what they're missing. They've lived their entire lives within fear-based frameworks, so chronic anxiety about existence seems normal. They don't realize that the constant monitoring, the guilt about joy, the suspicion of vitality, these aren't inherent to being human. They're specific effects of a specific framework they could choose to leave. Sixth, the framework benefits from comparing itself to nihilism or hedonism rather than to life-affirming philosophy. Without fear of God, you'd have no morality, no meaning, no purpose. This false dichotomy makes people think their only choices are religious fear or meaningless chaos. They don't consider that you could have profound meaning, strong ethics, and deep purpose based on loving life, rather than fearing divine punishment. Seventh, leaving fear-based religion requires confronting mortality and uncertainty without comforting answers. It means facing that you might just die and that's it. That the universe might not care about you, that you're responsible for creating meaning rather than receiving it from God. This is genuinely difficult, which makes people reluctant to question the framework even when they recognize it's damaging them. The fear of uncertainty keeps them in the fear-based system. Eighth, the framework provides community and belonging. Religious communities built around shared fear of God create real social connection, which people value deeply. Questioning the fear-based framework risks losing that community, which is painful enough that most people avoid it. The social benefits obscure the psychological costs of organizing life around divine terror. Finally, recognizing this pattern requires admitting you've potentially wasted years or decades being afraid of something that was preventing you from living fully. If you're 40 and realize you've spent your whole life anxious about divine judgment when you could have been embracing existence, That's devastating. The sunk cost is high enough that continuing to believe the fear was appropriate feels easier than facing what you've lost. Nietzsche could see through this, partly because his classical education exposed him to pre-Christian frameworks that celebrated life rather than fearing divine judgment. He saw that the fear-based model wasn't universal or natural. It was a specific cultural development with specific effects, and he had the courage to pursue the truth even when it meant losing his community, his professional standing, and his comfort. Here's the final revelation that brings everything into liberating focus. The choice isn't between believing in God or not believing in God. The real choice is between organizing your life around fear or organizing it around love. Fear of divine punishment or love of life itself. And when you examine what each produces, the answer becomes clear. Fear makes you anxious, diminished, unable to fully inhabit your existence. Love makes you present, vital, capable of experiencing deeply and creating meaningfully. This doesn't require proving God doesn't exist. Even if some form of divine reality exists, the question remains, is your relationship with it based on terror or love? Is your spirituality making you more alive or less? Is it expanding your capacity for experience and creation, or is it making you afraid of your own vitality? Because if the sacred is real, wouldn't it want you to be fully alive rather than chronically anxious? Nietzsche's alternative isn't nihilism or meaningless hedonism. It's what he called life affirmation, the profound yes to existence that comes from loving your life so completely you'd willing live it eternally, just as it is. This is the deepest possible spirituality because it's about embracing the actual sacred reality you have, your existence, your experience, your capacity to create and connect, rather than fearing an imagined deity and waiting for an imagined afterlife. This means fundamentally reorienting your spiritual life. Instead of asking, "Am I pleasing God?" ask, "Am I fully alive?" Instead of fearing divine judgment, love the life you actually have. Instead of being suspicious of joy, embrace it as sacred experience. Instead of suppressing your vitality, recognize it as life expressing itself through you. Instead of waiting for heaven, create meaning and beauty here, now, in the only life you know you have. So here's what this means practically. First, notice when religious fear operates in your psychology. When you feel guilty about experiencing joy, that's the fear. When you suppress your vitality because it might be worldly, that's the fear. When you can't fully be present because you're worried about divine judgment, that's the fear. Recognize these moments and choose differently. Choose to be here, to experience fully, to say yes to being alive. Second, practice what Nietzsche called amor fati, love of fate. Look at your actual life, with all its struggles and imperfections, and find ways to love it. Not in spite of its difficulties, but including them, because they're part of the life that's made you who you are. This isn't passive resignation, it's active affirmation. You choose to love the life you have, rather than wishing it were something else, or waiting for a better one later. Third, develop practices that cultivate presence and life affirmation. Meditation that helps you be fully here, rather than always anxious about being judged. Movement and dance that help you inhabit your body, rather than treating it as fallen. Creative expression that lets you bring your unique vision into existence. Connection with nature that reminds you the sacred is immediate, not distant. Whatever practices help you say yes to existence, rather than no. Fourth, pursue what brings you alive. Not what you think should bring you alive based on religious teaching, but what actually does. What makes you feel most present, most vital, most yourself. Do more of that. You don't need permission from an external authority. Your aliveness itself is the authority. Trust what makes you more fully human rather than suppressing it, because religious frameworks say it's dangerous. Fifth, create your own meaning and values based on what actually serves life rather than accepting imposed values designed to make you afraid. Ask yourself, does this belief make me more alive or less? Does this practice expand my capacity for experience or contract it? Does this value serve my flourishing or suppress it? Let life affirmation be your criterion rather than compliance with religious fear. The final question isn't whether God exists, it's whether you want to spend your life afraid or spend it loving existence itself. Because those who organize their lives around fearing God often discover at the end that the fear prevented them from ever really living. They were so worried about divine judgment they never fully experienced the life they had. They were so focused on pleasing A distant deity, they never recognize the sacred in immediate experience. You have another choice. You can recognize that whatever is truly divine wouldn't want you afraid. It would want you fully alive, experiencing deeply, creating beautifully, loving completely. When you love living, God stops being fear and becomes, if anything, the life force expressing itself through you. The sacred isn't something distant to fear. It's the aliveness you can embrace right now. Stop being afraid. Start loving the life you actually have. The most profound spiritual practice isn't fearing divine punishment. It's saying yes to existence with such fullness that you'd willingly live this exact life infinitely. That's not blasphemy. That's what real spirituality looks like when it's freed from fear.